Okay, so we are starting with the session. I hope all the panelists are able to hear me and everybody. I am audible to everyone.
Yes,
Yeah.
Kanika.
Yes, you are. Okay, so let's start. So a very good evening and a warm welcome to everybody. We are so glad that we have so many participants and a very happy Mother's Day to all the mothers who are listening to us. I'm sure there must be so many mothers listening today to this panel discussion. So we are starting today with the first webinar of our Uplift webinar series, and we will be discussing on the topic of standardizing evaluation and treatment in infertility. I'm Dr. Kanika Kalyani. I'll be moderating the session, and my panelists are Dr. Anuja Singh, Dr. Reema Sarkar, Dr. Nitasha Gupta, and Dr. Sutaban. So today's webinar is about we are always confused that when an infertile couple comes to us, we just go blank. We don't know what to do. Since even after I passed my PG, when an infertile couple would come, I would think of so many tests, so many treatment options, and it was always a cloud of confusion in my mind. So today we are going to make it very simple and very clear that when an infertile couple comes, exactly what we are supposed to do and how we are supposed to treat. So what all things we are going to discuss today? We are going to be discussing about evaluating female infertility, evaluating male infertility, when to do natural planning, IUI and IVF. This is the biggest dilemma in our minds. So we have couples who come after 2 years of natural planning. We don't know when to step up to IUI. We have couples who come with 8 cycles of IUI. We don't know that when we should stop doing IUI and then think of IVF in those cases. And then lastly, we also have certain case scenarios and the discussion of their management by our expert panelists. So first we'll discuss about evaluating female infertility. So how do we define infertility? Infertility is defined as failure to achieve pregnancy within 12 months of unprotected intercourse or therapeutic donor insemination in women younger than 35 years or within 6 months in women older than 35 years. So whenever we are sitting in our clinic, we don't have to only look at the duration of a marriage and the duration since which they are trying to conceive. We also have to look at the age of the women. Especially now, since we practice in Bombay, I see so many couples who are getting married at 39, 38, 40. So when the age is more than 35, we have to take a quick action, define them as infertile within 6 months of trying to conceive. Now, recently, off late, there has been a very good increase in demand of infertility services because of working women. So now females are trying to make their career and then think of conceiving. There is an increase in effective treatments. There is no doubt that we have today more confidence in our treatments, in our success rates. We have more modalities, we have improved techniques, even the catheters, everything. We have much better equipments now to improve the success rates, and there is an increased awareness of such treatments. So now we come across, I also see patients who are already knowing about agonist protocol, antagonist protocol. So patients are well aware of what options they have. They just come and they ask about directly the treatment option that is suitable for them. So there is, and they know that today we have options which can actually help them conceive very early. So because of all these, there is a huge demand in treatment. Now, conventionally, there have been many causes of infertility. Conventionally, it was divided into three causes, mainly the male causes, female causes, and the combined male and female. So that was one third, and one third. But recently, we have a huge number, according to ASRM, that is 30% of couples who are actually under the category of unexplained infertility. In unexplained infertility, everything, all reports come out normal. So we assume that that can be because of the ciliary defect or the fertilization defect or a hatching defect in that couple. Now, I would like to discuss and ask certain questions to our panelists, and we would also take their opinion and we would enhance our knowledge. My first question goes out to Dr. Anuja ma'am. Dr. Anuja, when should a couple go for infertility evaluation?
Dr. Kanika, as you rightly said, that we have to investigate
First, we have to see the time frame, duration of infertility, and also the age. If the patient's age is more than 35 years, we should investigate earlier. And if the age is directly after 6 months, and if the age is less than 35 years, we can wait up till 1 year. But we shouldn't limit ourselves to that time frame. Suppose the patient is coming with severe dysmenorrhea. She may be having an endometriotic cyst, or she may be suffering from endometriosis. In those cases, we have to investigate earlier. She may be having amenorrhea, which may point to premature ovarian failure. So in those cases, we don't have to wait for 1 year time frame. So in some cases, when the patient age is more than 40 years, we know the ovarian reserve is less, more chances of aneuploidy is there. So in those cases also, we have to investigate earlier. And when we suspect some male factor, subfertility or infertility, or there is diagnosed endometriosis stage 3, stage 4, or we are suspecting some tubal disease, like as from TB, the patient has a history of ATT intake. In those cases also, we should investigate earlier and not limit to the time frame of 6 months or 1 year.
I think, Kanika, we are not able to hear you.
Yeah, thank you. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Anuja, for elaborating the indications when we should start investigating the couple. Now, I would like to ask a question to Dr. Nitasha. Dr. Nitasha, what are the baseline female investigations which are necessary to find the cause of infertility?
Yeah, see, counseling is an integral part for managing any infertile couple. Both should be counseled together. A comprehensive medical history should be taken, which involves the age of the patient, the duration of infertility, what all post-treatments or pre-treatments the patient has taken, any history of menstrual irregularities in the patient, history of any reproductive history which can be suggestive of recurrent pregnancy losses, or for that matter, any history of any mentally retarded child or any mental disability in the family is important. Sexual history, any dysfunction in both husband or wife is important. Also, any history of intake of alcohol, smoking, or drug abuse in these patients should be taken. Apart from that, a targeted, focused physical examination is very important in both husband and wife, which often is missed by the many infertility the physicians also. So that includes, in case now since we are just dealing with the female part, that includes the body mass index, the BMI, any features of thyroid enlargement, any evidence of breast secretions, also any evidence of androgen excess in such patients. Very important is a pelvic examination, which can be easily done in the OPD setup by a simple pulse speculum and per vaginal examination. Now, as a part of preconceptional workup, it is very important to get few blood tests done in the patients, like complete blood count, the blood group and RH status, the random blood sugar test, thyroid function test, infectious screen test, which includes HIV, HBsAg, HCV, VDRL, the anti-Mullerian hormone test, although it is not routinely indicated, and also an ultrasound. Now, there are three important tests which completes the basic evaluation of a husband and wife. First is the semen analysis. Second is any tests which will confirm the ovulation in the female partner, the ovarian reserve tests if indicated, and also the tubal patency test. Now, according to the WHO standards 2010, the total semen count should be more than 39 million per ml. The motility should be more than 40% with 32% progressive motile forms, and the morphology should be more than 4% by the strict Kruger's criteria. Now, when we talk about the ovarian reserve test, although it is not routinely indicated, but tests like AMH, anti-Mullerian hormone test, this is a glycomeric protein which is secreted by the granulosa cells of the preantral follicles and tells us about the fertility pool of any patient. So this test, AMH, is especially helpful in the patients who are more than 35 years of age, and also prognosticate the output fertility outcome in case the patient is placed for IVF or ICSI. Now, apart from this, we have an antral follicle count. It can be done by a simple non-invasive ultrasound, which will tell us about the number of follicles a patient is having per ovary. So a normal antral follicle count is around 8 to 15. Anything less than 8 is a low antral follicle count, and anything more than 15 is suggestive of a hyper responder in case the patient has to take treatment further, as in the form of IUI or IVF. Now, when we are talking about the tubal patency test, it's very important. We all know about the HSG, hysterosalpingography, and the Hikosi test and the SIS test. Now, the latest evidence-based recommendations have suggested that Hikosi test, which is a hysterosalpingo contrast sonography test, it is a ultrasound-based test in which a water-soluble dye is put into the uterine cavity. It's an OPD procedure in which no radiations are included, and in this test we can easily tell about any uterine problems like having polyps or no, also delineate the tubes. So this test is equivalent to getting a hysteroscopy also done. So a simple non-invasive effective tool is an ultrasound, which we all have in our infert or any clinics nowadays. A 2D and a 3D ultrasound will not only tell us about the antral follicle count, it will also tell us about the adnexal pathology. If so, if we can rule out any ecogenic tubular structure which can be suggestive of hydrosalpinx, we can also know about the uterine Mullerian anomalies, the cornu when we scoop through the ultrasound probe. Many things can be, and as well as the endometrium, the type of endometrium, whether it is triple layer or it's a thin endometrium, it's having synechiae, all can be judged by a simple ultrasound in our OPD setting. So a basic investigations, if done meticulously and systematically, will help us definitely get the cause and hence the treatment of the patient.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nitasha. So as Dr. Nitasha has explained, we have to basically, it's very simple. We have to focus on the ovary, the ovulatory dysfunction, whether ovulation is happening or not, the tubes, the patency, and the endometrium, the uterus. So, and adnexa. So these are the things, very simple, we have to assess in the baseline testing. Now we are moving to the next question. I would like to ask Dr. Rima. Dr. Rima, besides these baseline investigations, what are the other investigations which should be carried out while evaluating an infertile female?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kanika. So, good evening, all. Other than the mandatory investigations that Dr. Nitasha just spoke about, I'll be talking about certain other additional investigations which may be offered to an infertile woman just to complete the workup of that woman. So, I'll be taking all of these one by one. First in the list would be rubella testing. All of us know that rubella, if it does occur during pregnancy, it can lead to significant malformations in the offspring. Since it is a preventable condition, so I would say it is advisable that it is good practice to test the woman beforehand, before starting her on any infertility treatment, to test her for rubella status. A simple serology test can be done. And if found susceptible, these women should also be offered a vaccination for the same. Point of caution here, however, would be that the pregnancy now should be deferred for at least a month, since it is a live attenuated virus. Next in line would be pap smear. We all know that in our country, we follow the policy of universal and opportunistic screening for cervical cancer. And there is no reason why an infertility OPD should be an exception to this. So any woman, whether she's coming for infertility treatment, she should undergo a cervical cancer screening by either conventional pap smear or with a liquid-based cytology. Serum prolactin. Now, this is very interesting. All of us gynecologists, whether it's me or you, any woman who comes to our OPD with the complaint of inability to conceive, all of us are just conditioned to write a few tests for her, which include usually, thyroid and prolactin as well. So prolactin, however, certain international bodies do not seem to agree with us with the same. According to them, like ASRM as well as NICE guidelines, serum prolactin should not be a routine test. Instead, it should only be offered to women if there is a certain sign or symptoms of suggestive of an ovulation. For example, if the lady has oligomenorrhea, or if there is a demonstrable galactorrhea, or if there is a history of pituitary tumor. So next is endometrial biopsy. Now, I remember when I was a resident, around 15, 16 years back, We used to have our infertility OPD every Tuesday, Friday, and after every OPD, we would be given around 3 to 4 EBs to do during our lunchtime. And of course, at that time, our consultants were very fond of doing EB, and they used to do it as a first-line routine test for all the female partners. At that time, they used to do it to document ovulation, to see the endometrium is secretory or not, and for endometrial dating purpose. Of course, we've come a long way from there. We have much better tests to see the ovulation nowadays. However, I would still say that EB is not a test that can just be discounted just like that and can be written off. In certain conditions, of course, EB does have a role. And just to name a few, for example, if to begin with, in an initial evaluation, in initial transvaginal sonogram, if you found that the endometrial thickness was very thin, or there's a history that suggests that the lady might be having COX, then it is worthwhile to do a biopsy and send it for gene expert, as well as for AFP cultures, as well as for histopathology. Similarly, if you find on routine TBS on initial evaluation that the endometrium was very thick, 16, 17, 18 mm thickness, at that time, again, I would say it is advisable to take a biopsy right in the beginning and to check out for any hyperplasias or for any atypias before you put this lady again on any hormonal therapy. Vitamin D levels, again, evidence is very fast. It is building up that deficient vitamin D levels are associated with a lot of infertility conditions, especially in PCOS and in endometriosis. It is even implicated in pathophysiology now. And also the studies are coming up that if you treat these deficient levels, that is, which are lower than 20 milligram per ml, if you bring them up to 30, so the response to treatment of infertility is even better. So we would now suggest that vitamin D levels must be incorporated in the initial investigations of an infertile woman. Laparoscopy, hysteroscopy, now neither laparo nor hystero is routinely indicated for any infertile woman as a routine test. Both of them, however, have a role in certain indications, certain specific indications. For example, laparoscopy, if you find, if there is an SSG done or an HSG done, and you see that the findings are either inconclusive or you want to check on your findings, then you may probably proceed on to do a diagnostic laparoscopy with chromoperturbation. Also, in case, for example, if there's a case of unexplained infertility and there is no other cause found, but there is clinical history is very suggestive of, let's say, endometriosis. For example, if the woman has dysmenorrhea or chronic pelvic pain or fixed retroverted uterus, uterosacrals are tender, and you strongly suspect that if you do a laparoscopy, you're going to find endometriotic implants and that's going to change your treatment a lot, then it is worthwhile to do a laparoscopy. However, ESHRE at this time tells that laparoscopy for this indication should also, one should be prepared that if you do find endometriotic implants, they should be dealt with and ablated in the same setting, right? Similarly, hysteroscopy, again, it should not be routinely done. However, if you find some pathology, for example, a polyp or a submucous fibroid or adhesions or thin endometrium, then might as well do a hysteroscopy before starting the treatment. Breast imaging, yes, again, more than 40 years of age, especially if you're going to start your own hormones, then it is, I think, prudent to do a breast imaging. And not only that, it would be a better, it would be a good practice guideline to, in fact, take a physician clearance before you start the treatment, especially IVF, and do all the investigations as suggested by them also. It would be nicer. Now, I've listed so many investigations. Again, it is now, the onus is again on the treating doctor, because if you're going to prescribe all of these investigations to a particular woman, then probably you're going to exhaust all her resources before even starting the treatment. So, of course, to conclude, I would say just individualize the case, just see which all particular tests would be required in this particular patient, and then accordingly, give her the investigations. And more so, it is important to know what not to do, I would say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rima. That was nice of you to enumerate all the causes, and I would specially focus on rubella testing, which we have recently started doing, and importance of vaccinating against rubella, and also waiting for a month before we start infertility treatment. Secondly, I would also like to talk about endometrial biopsy. It is of utmost importance when the endometrium is more than 16-17 mm. I have come across a case like that when endometrium was above 16. We went for an biopsy, hysteroscopy guided biopsy, and that came out to be malignancy. So we are not supposed to start treatment of infertility unless we have a normal biopsy report. Thank you so much, Dr. Rima. Now that was about evaluating female infertility. Now let's come to male infertility. My next question is to Dr. Sutapon. Dr. Sutapon, when evaluating an infertile male, what investigations do you feel are baseline and should be routinely done? And which ones are special needed only in certain circumstances?
Yes, thank you for the question. And when evaluating an infertile male, most guidelines consider that the basic evaluation should include a reproductive history and semen analysis. Now, in reproductive history, particular focus should be given on examination of male external genitalia, and that include examination of the penis, noting the location of urethral meatus, then palpation of testis, including measurement of their size, then presence and consistency of vas deferens and epididymis, clinical presence of any varicocele, then secondary sexual characteristics like body habitus or hair distribution and breast development, and digital rectal examination in few selected cases. Now, for semen analysis, guideline differ regarding the minimum number of semen analysis to be evaluated. However, ASRM considered that at least one specimen is required, and as per NICE guideline, if the result of the first semen analysis is abnormal, then a repeat confirmatory test should be done after 3 months of therapy. However, if there is gross abnormality, like if there is severe oligospermia or agiospermia, that then repeat test can be done as soon as possible. And ideally 2 to 3 days of abstinence is required, and most important, laboratory proficiency has to be maintained as per standard laid down in WHO 2000 manual for human semen processing. Now coming to special investigation, endocrine evaluation that includes serum testosterone, FSH and estradiol is indicated in men having abnormally low sperm count, particularly if it is below 10 million per ml, or when there is history of impaired sexual function or decreased libido, and when clinical findings suggestive of specific endocrinopathy like hypothyroidism or hyperprolactinemia, etc. Then next investigation can be post-ejaculatory urine analysis, and it should be done in all cases when you get ejaculate volume below 1 ml and when you clinical suspicion of retrograde ejaculation. Then transrectal ultrasound, it can be indicated in agiospermic patient to rule out any ejaculatory duct obstruction. Then scrotal ultrasound is to be done in inadequate physical examination of the scrotum or when you suspect any testicular mass. Then sperm DFI, there is a controversy with that. However, as per ASRM, routine testing should not be done, and sperm DFI or DNA fragmentation index should be done in certain cases, like when there is previous history of IVF failure or 3 or more IUI failure, or history of recurrent pregnancy loss or recurrent implantation failure, and in presence of clinical varicocele. Then coming to genetic evaluation, genetic testing for CFTR mutation should ideally be offered to female partner in male partner having the congenital absence of vas deferens to rule out any concomitant genetic abnormality in female partner. Now lastly, high resolution karyotype and Y chromosome microdeletion should be offered in all cases when you suspect non-obstructive agiospermia. So these are the special investigation, and that should be done only in selective cases.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sutapon. Now moving on to the next question. So as I told you, we'll end up thinking of so many tests and we feel we should be doing this, we should be doing that. So there are many confusing tests which we feel whether it is indicated, and what if we don't do this, whether we'll end up in trouble. So there are some times where when we land up doing unnecessary investigations in an infertile couple. So what are those tests which are often performed, but they should not be routinely offered to patients? Dr. Anuja. Dr. Anuja?
Yes. As Dr. Reema was telling, that knowing what not to do is as important as knowing what to do. Like we tend to be over enthusiastic while doing investigations in infertile couple, and to tend to burden them more financially and emotionally also. So it's better that we should avoid some tests which are basically of theoretical value, like endometrial biopsy for dating, then doing post-coital tests. These tests have got no value in the present day scenario. They are obsolete basically nowadays. Then, as Dr. Remo was telling about diagnostic lab and histro, these are not to be done routinely, as we will be subjecting the patients to unnecessary anesthetic and surgical risk. So we should avoid doing it, especially in cases of unexplained infertility, because it doesn't change the clinical course of treatment. Basically, the same thing is with DFI. DFI should be done in certain indications only, in repeated implantation failure, or when we have to counsel the patient, because it is not going to change the clinical course of treatment for a patient. There are some tests like serum prolactin, which we routinely do, but actually it is not recommended. It should be done only in cases patients presenting with galacturia or menstrual abnormalities like oligomenorrhea or amenorrhea. In those cases will be, or irregular periods, in those cases only we'll be doing serum prolactin. And thrombophilia testing is also quite pro nowadays. People are thinking that we should go for thrombophilia testing, we should screen those patients, but it is unnecessary because it leads to financial burden itself. Only in those cases which have a history of venous thrombosis, in those we can do, or repeated implantation failure, in those we can do. Immunological typing and immunological testing, carrier typing, these are more needed in recurrent abortion cases. So these things like diagnostic lab, DFI, serum prolactin, these needs to be avoided routinely unless and until indicated.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anuja. Exactly, you are right. We'll end up doing some tests which are for basically recurrent implantation failure and for recurrent pregnancy loss. We'll end up doing them in infertile couples when they are not indicated. So thank you for the answer. Now let us see what the guidelines say about the female evaluation and male evaluation in an infertile couple. So the guideline, the ASRM says that evaluation should be done after 12 months of or more of regular unprotected intercourse in a young couple. But as we already mentioned, that after 6 months of unsuccessful efforts in a woman above 35 years also, we are supposed to evaluate. And also in special cases when the woman has oligomenorrhea, amenorrhea, any uterine, tubular, peritoneal disease, or endometriosis grade 3 or grade 4. Now, diagnostic evaluation in female. Dr. Natasha covered it very well. We are supposed to see the ovulatory function, the structure, and the patency of the female reproductive tract. That means the fallopian tubes, the semen analysis. We also have concluded, the guidelines also have concluded that ovarian reserve testing, it is not to be routinely performed, but it's a very useful prognostic indicator when we are stimulating a patient. So when we are doing an IVF stimulation, AMH definitely helps in predicting the response. Routine laparoscopy is not to be performed. It may be warranted when there is a strong suspicion of advanced stage endometriosis, tubal occlusive disease, or peritoneal factors. And as Dr. Rima also explained, that when we are going in, we see any endometriosis, endometriotic patches, we should be prepared at the same time to ablate those patches. Post-coital testing and endometrial biopsy should not be performed as a routine test. Now, what does the ASRM guidelines say about the infertile male evaluation? So again, it is indicated in the same conditions as female, that is the couple has failed for 12 months. And after 6 months of unexplained infertility, female partner is more than 35 years. Men having concerns about their future fertility also merit evaluation. Earlier evaluation may be warranted if there are specific male or female infertility risk factors. And thorough history and evaluation, as Dr. Sutapon explained, is very much necessary. Semen analysis is the cornerstone of laboratory evaluation of infertile male. Now, if semen parameters come abnormal, we are going to do endocrine, TRUS, post-ejaculatory urine analysis, and the specialized tests are only indicated in certain cases. Also, men with non-obstructive azoospermia should be offered karyotyping and Y chromosome analysis. Now, coming to the next topic. So this was all about evaluation. Now, I hope we all are clear about what to do in a female and what to do in a male. Now, once we have evaluated, we know the tubal patency, we know ovulatory function, we know the uterus, endometrium, everything, and we know the semen analysis report. Now, we have to think about these three treatment modalities. One is natural planning, the second is IUI, and the third is IVF. Now, different guidelines tell us different things. We have to come to a conclusion in which cases, how we should go about with what modality of treatment, which is the best treatment for which couple. Now, my question is to Dr. Anuja. Dr. Anuja, which couples are the ideal candidates for natural planning?
Yes, Dr. Kanika. Ideally, only mild male factor infertility patients are the ideal candidate for natural planning. But if the patient is young and the patient has unexplained infertility or mild to minimal endometriosis, those patients are not usually willing for any interventions. In those cases, the guideline says that we can wait for 6 months. However, in those also, ovarian stimulation with IUI is a better course of treatment. Okay. Kanika.
Dr. Anuja, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So actually, when we are going for natural planning, we are advising a patient for natural planning. It is very important also to explain the couple that what are the chances, what is the success rate. So I would like to ask Dr. Sutapan, what is the success rate for natural planning?
Yes, there is actually no simple answer. However, age and number of months the couple are trying to get pregnant are two important factors that affect the chance of success. And for women having regular menstrual cycle, frequent intercourse, that is 2 to 3 times in a week, beginning soon after cessation of menses, can help to maximize the fecundability. And for young fertile couple, the chance of conception varies from 20% to 37% during the first 3 months of trying, and it increased to 80% in the first year and near about 90% in second year of trying. However, women when the age is more than 35 years, and in case of men having age of more than 50 years, have lower chance of success.
Yes, that is very important, and we should make the couple aware of the success rate and what are the chances and what are the next treatment options for them once this fails. Thank you so much, Dr. Sutapan. Now let's see what the guideline says about natural planning. So as we all know, we know this since years and years that the age of the female, as the age of the female increases, the rate of pregnancy decreases. So this graph is exactly showing that. And we also know that age is a very important prognostic factor for even ovarian reserve. As age increases, the ovarian reserve decreases, the quality of oocytes decreases. Now, ASRM 2016 also says that apart from mentioning that time to conception increases with age, it also says that the devices which are designed to predict ovulation may be useful for couples who have infrequent intercourse. So the ovulation kits that the couples are using are very useful. It also says that frequent versus less frequent intercourse, in those couples who have frequent intercourse, they have higher chances of conceiving through natural pregnancy. Now, coming to the next question, my next question is for Dr. Natasha. Dr. Natasha, what are the indications of IUI? And we would also like to know what is the success rate of IUI?
Yeah, thanks, Kanika. See, usually IUI is the first line of treatment for any infertility couple approaching an infertility specialist. So it should be done in those couples in which the female has at least one patent tube, or in the males where the total motile sperm count is 5 to 10 million per ml with a motility of more than 30% and a morphology of more than 4% normal forms. So IUI is usually indicated in the couples where the male has subnormal semen parameters, or there is some sexual dysfunction like erectile dysfunction or hyperspadias, retrograde ejaculation or premature ejaculation. It is indicated in females who are suffering with mild or minimal endometriosis endometriosis, in patients with anovulation, patients who've undergone some cervical surgery like loop or leap excision, or a cone biopsy. It's also indicated in patients or couples with HIV discordancy and unexplained infertility. Although NICE guidelines 2013 have said that patients with unexplained infertility can straight away head for IVF. Now, IUI with donor sperms is indicated in couples who are having azoospermia, or they are having some genetic disorders or severe Rh incompatibility. But it is very important also to know that when is IUI not to be done. First, when a female is having bilateral block tubes, or if the husband is having severe OATS, or there is grade 3, grade 4 endometriosis, if the age of the woman is more than 40 years, because the success rate will be very less, or in case the patient is having severe PID. Usually 3 to 4 cycles of IUI, the 5th and 6th cycle are not going to give any good success rates of IUI. So in case the couple is have had 3 to 4 cycles of IUI, should not undergo more cycles of IUI. Now, when you're talking about the success rate, the success rate of a single IUI cycle is around 8 to 14%. Now, this large ranges because the success rates of IUI decreases in patients with endometriosis or with severe male factor infertility. And in case we are doing consecutive IUI cycles, the success rate jumps up to even 40 to 45%. It is often seen that IUI with donor sperms always have 5 to 10% more success rates than as compared to the IUI with the husband.
Thank you so much for your answer, Dr. Natasha. So we must explain the patient when the patient is going for IUI. It's very important to explain the patient about the success rate in one cycle, and that they might need 3 or 4 cycles to decide whether IUI is actually helping them or not, because some patients get very anxious about the results. So it's very important. And we also come across males with sperm count 4 million, 5 million, and they want to go for IUI. So it's very important to explain them that what is the right treatment for them. Now let's go on to the next question. My next question is for Dr. Anuja. Dr. Anuja, what are the indications of IVF, and when is the right time for a couple to go for IVF?
As IVF is basically indicated if there is bilateral tubal blockage or doubtful tubal patency, which we all know. But IVF is also indicated in those cases in which we are finding endometriosis stage 3 and 4. ESHRE also says that it should be done because there is no point of wasting time in case of frozen pelvis cases. And also if there is moderate to severe semen abnormalities, sperm abnormalities we are seeing, then there is no point in doing IUI. We should go for IVF straight away. In unexplained infertility, if we have the patient has undergone 3 to 4 cycles of IUI, then it's better to shift to IVF. However, the NICE guidelines says that if 2 years, 2 years of infertility and the patient has unexplained infertility, they should go for IVF instead of going for IUI. And when there are repeated failure of IUI cycles, like 3 to 4 cycles of failed IUI, then also we should go for IVF. Along with it, in patients with advanced maternal age, like more than 40 years, we should have a lower threshold for IUI. We should go for IVF straight away in such cases.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anuja. And especially just like Dr. Natasha also explained, NICE guidelines now says that even after 2 years of unexplained infertility, like ASRM recommends giving them oral agents for ovulation induction and recommends IUI in unexplained infertility. NICE guidelines says that we must directly go for IVF in such patients, even including that 1 year where they have not got evaluated. So NICE is more towards IVF in unexplained infertility cases. Now, my next question is for Dr. Suttapan. Dr. Suttapan, we all see patients undergoing diagnostic laparoscopy. When is diagnostic laparoscopy indicated in infertile patients according to you?
Yes, as already discussed, laparoscopy, although a gold standard in workup of infertility, it should not be routine. However, it can be done in case when you suspect any anomalies in HSG report, like Mullerian abnormalities, or next is in exclusion of bilateral anatomical tubal pathology that could avoid unnecessary IVF treatment by correction of peritubal adhesions. And next is tubal ligation reversal surgery to assess the feasibility of sterilization reversal versus straightaway referral for IVF can also be determined. And then diagnostic laparoscopy can also furnish unsuspected information in case of asymptomatic pelvic endometriosis or occult tuberculosis in assessing the severity and the extent of adhesion. So it should be done only in selective cases and should not be done routinely in all infertile patients.
Yes, that is very important. We must know when to do and when not to do. Thank you so much, Dr. Sutapon. Now, we all learned about the testing in female patients and in male patients. We all learned. Now we are coming to what treatment options. The take-home message about these treatment options that we discussed above is, in short, that natural planning we could try for 6 months in indicated cases. And if 6 months of natural planning do not give us any result, or if the couple actually needs donor sperm, then we can directly go for IUI. IUI, we can go for 3 to 4 cycles, and we can try with the best agents like letrozole, like clomiphene citrate, like gonadotropins if required, second line. And if 3 to 4 cycles of IUI fail, we must go for IVF-ICSI. Also, other indications of IVF-ICSI are bilateral tubal block, severe male factor, and as NICE guidelines say, unexplained infertility for more than 2 years. Now, we have discussed all the treatment modalities. Now we'll go to individual case scenarios, and we would also like to take some expert opinion of our panelists. So my first question is for Dr. Reema. A couple comes to the clinic. Wife is 26 years old, husband is 27 years old, married since 3 years. Wife's both fallopian tubes are patent. Her AMH is 3, endometrium is 9 mm on day 18 of her menses with corpus luteum seen in the right ovary. Semen parameters are normal. How should we go about in the management of this patient?
Yeah, thank you, Kanika. So you've given me a young couple. The wife's ovarian reserve is normal, her AMH is good, endometrium is good, tubes are patent, and husband's parameters are also normal. So another information that you have given me here is the presence of corpus luteum, which is seen in the right ovary. So this information tells me that this woman is ovulating as well. So if everything is normal, this now I think becomes a case of unexplained infertility. This couple has now already tried for 3 years, and now they have come to me for further intervention. So at this point of time, after completing all the additional workup that has already been discussed, and at this point assuming that this couple already knew about fertile period and have been practicing the same, with this knowledge, I would now like to offer them ovarian stimulation with oral ovalogens along with intrauterine insemination. Of course, according to the literature, either of clomiphene or letrozole can be given. Both of them have found to have the similar clinical pregnancy rates. However, I prefer giving letrozole. That is just for the simple reason that I want to avoid the anti-estrogenic effects of clomiphene. So I'll probably start her on letrozole 2.5 BD starting from day 2, day 3 for about 5 days, and then follow up with TBS monitoring. And whenever the follicle reaches around 20-22 millimeters, I'll give her a trigger and plan an IUI around 35 plus hours of the trigger. And of course, then I'll tell her to come back after 2 weeks to me and probably, prescribe a UPT or a uterine pregnancy test and hope for the best. Assuming that my whatever I did for her did not work and we were not that lucky and her UPT is negative. If it comes down negative, I'll then sit down with them for again a session of counseling and maybe talk to them that even in best of scenarios also IUI can fail, and actually the success rate could only be 18 to 20%. So I like to tell them that they can actually go in for another 1 or 2 cycles of oral ovalogens, or that is letros plus IUI, and offer them the same. Let's say even after 2 or 3 cycles of IUI, also having done everything for them also, still they fail to conceive. At this point of time, Dr. Kanika, I would like to take them out for in vitro fertilization. IVF is what I would recommend at this point of time, and this is what I'll talk about. Why? Because this here is a slight change in normal practice that me or all my colleagues, fertility colleagues, were practicing. That initially we used to give her the couple oral ovulations with IUI in a case of unexplained infertility, and if that failed, we used to try and take them up for IUI again, this time with gonadotropin stimulation. However, with the recent recommendations that have been given by ASL, in fact, this year, February only, they found that the success rates were not increasing by adding gonadotropin IUI. And if the success...
Thank you so much for your answer, Dr. Rima. We got the message very well. It was well taken that initially we are supposed to go with IUI. Now let's see what the guidelines say about unexplained infertility. So ASRM says that first we have to go with ovarian stimulation with IUI, which is better than an unstimulated IUI. So these are very important points that you have to remember in IUI, unexplained infertility. So first thing, unstimulated IUI in unexplained infertility is inferior to ovarian stimulation with IUI. Timed intercourse with letrozole or gonadotropin is not recommended. Natural cycle IUI is inferior to clomiphene citrate plus or gonadotropin with IUI. And recommended is, as Dr. Rima explained rightly, that letrozole and IUI is the recommended treatment. So the bottom line is that we have to stimulate. So ovarian stimulation and IUI is better than any natural cycle or unstimulated IUI. If the woman is less than 38 years old, according to ASRM, IVF is not the first line therapy. If the woman is more than 38 years old, pregnancy rate is higher if we go with immediate IVF, and if a woman is having low ovarian reserve especially. And as I already told you twice, that NICE guideline says that we have to directly go for IVF. Now, my next question is for Dr. Nitasha. A 30 years old female came to infertility clinic with inability to conceive since 2 years. Her cycles are irregular and her USG shows bilateral enlarged ovaries with increased number of follicles with peripheral distribution. Semen parameters are normal and bilateral tubes are patent. So Dr. Nitasha, I have two questions for you. First, how would you manage her if her main complaint was irregular cycles? Will you treat her irregular cycles? And if yes, then how? And my second question to you is, what should be our plan of action to help this lady conceive?
Yeah, thank you, Kanika. See, since she's a young patient, her cycles are irregular. Probably she might be having anovulatory cycles or maybe oligoanovulatory cycles. And she's showing a pattern which is suggestive of PCO. So such PCO, it is very important to, confirm the diagnosis before labeling any patient as PCO. Now, in case this patient has a high BMI of more than 25 kg per meter square, I will ask her to go for weight reduction, because 5 to 10% of weight reduction will resume her periods to be normal. Along with that, I will also advise the patient to undergo some certain lifestyle modifications, such as dietary restriction, which includes a low carbohydrate diet and a high fiber rich diet. Also, to practice moderate exercise, which means 150 minutes per week. Now, finally, in case she just wants to resume her cycles or get regular cycles and she's not very anxious about pregnancy, then I will put her on combined oral contraceptive pills, which have a very low dose of ethinyl estradiol, that is 20 micrograms. It is also seen that in case the patient's BMI is more than 25 kg per meter square, a simple addition of metformin to their diet in a BD or gradually to the TDS dose will give them a weight reduction as well as regularize the cycle in about 50 to 70% of the patients. But in case she does not mind being pregnant in the course of treatment, then it is better to put such patients on progestrogens or progesterones, medroxyprogesterone acetate from day 15 to day 25 of cycle for maybe 6 months or more. Now your second part, in case she wants to conceive. Now she is married since 2 years. Her tubes and all, if they are normal with normal semen parameters, then apart from weight reduction, in case she is heavyweight, and lifestyle modifications, I will like to put her on oral ovulagens. My first line of treatment will be to put her on letrozole. But in case letrozole is not available, I would put her on clomiphene resistant clomiphene citrate. But in case the patient is having clomiphene citrate resistant, that means she is not ovulating. Ideally, patients are seen to ovulate in 40% of cases, which will give them pregnancy rates of 80%. But in case of clomiphene citrate resistant, I would like to add on either metformin, and in case that also does not work, then my second line of treatment, I will put these patients on low dose gonadotropins, and in case she ovulates, I will like to take her for IUI. But in case such patients do not conceive, even after gonadotropins, even after 3 or 4 cycles of IUI, then I would like to place this patient for IVF.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Ritasha, for clearly explaining the management of this patient. Now, we would go ahead with knowing what the recommendation says. Now, this is very simple. Recommendations for PCOS patients when they come for infertility treatment. So, first line for ovulation induction is letrozole according to ASRM. Now, in certain countries, letrozole is not available. In those cases, we can go with clomiphene citrate, while explaining the couple that there are chances she's at high risk of having multiple pregnancy. Also, ASRM says that clomiphene citrate, like you also requested us to add metformin in those patients. So clomiphene citrate plus metformin is better than clomiphene citrate alone. Also, if it fails, if the couple is, woman is clomiphene citrate resistant, the second line is gonadotropins. Again, ASRM also concluded that gonadotropin plus metformin is better than gonadotropin alone. And in CC, clomiphene citrate resistant patients, gonadotropins or lap ovarian drilling also can be done. Now, moving on to the next question. My next question is for Dr. Anuja. Dr. Anuja, a 26-year-old female married since 4 years, keen to conceive, comes to you. Her HSG shows bilateral tubal block. Her AMH is 2.6 mm. ET is 8 mm on day 16. She has taken AKT treatment for 3 years, 3 years back for 9 months. I have again 2 questions for you. First, what would be your plan of management of this patient? Second, and how would the management be different according to you? If her HSG showed one tube blocked and the other tube patent, how will you manage them? Dr. Anuja?
Yes, my network was interrupted actually. Okay, I'm seeing your question. And yes,
so
here
how will you manage this patient?
Here I'm seeing that the most important thing from the treatment point of view is the patient had taken treatment for TB 3 years back. After that, HSG is showing bilateral tubal block. We know that TB affects the functionality of the tube in most of the cases of genital TB, because it causes ciliary damage. So in such patients, if the HSG showing bilateral tubal block, so ideal will be to go for IVF instead of confirming it again through diagnostic lab, because we know that the HSG sensitivity is usually 40%. But because the patient had TB, we'll counsel the patient for IVF. In addition, we'll go for ultrasound to see that whether there is any hydrosalpinx is there or not. If we find a hydrosalpinx, then we'll go for laparoscopy and go for salpingectomy, and then plan IVF. And your second question was if a HSG showing one tube blocked. In those cases also, I'd prefer IVF, but usually the patients are not counseled. The patient I usually want to go for IUI. In such patients also, I'd like to go for diagnostic lab to see whether the tubes and ovaries are in proper alignment or not. If everything is fine, then we can go for IUI. And if in 3 to 4 cycles of IUI they don't conceive, then we can go for IVF. But if in diagnostic lab we are finding a frozen pelvis and the tubes are even open, then also we'll go for IVF in such patients.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anuja. Now again, we'll go to the evidence. So that there is this study about hydrosalpinges which was published in Fertile Sterile. So as we can see that they found a definite improvement in pregnancy rates, implantation rates in patients in cases where the tubal occlusion was done. So the success rate was far more better in the cases where tubal occlusion was done. Now, how do we go about with the management in blocked tubes? So the guidelines say the following things. They are very clearly differentiated. First thing is proximal tubal obstruction, especially when it is in the young women. How should we manage? We can go ahead with tubal cannulation. Mild hydrosalpinges, especially again in young women, because young women have good ovarian reserve, all the uterine factors, everything is fine. So the second option that we can do in mild hydrosalpinges, the treatment can be laparoscopic fimbrioplasty or neosalpingostomy. Now, the treatment differs in surgically irreparable hydrosalpinges. Evidence says, and that is why ASRM recommends, that laparoscopic salpingectomy or proximal tubal occlusion should be done if we want to improve IVF pregnancy rates. Again, microsurgical anastomosis for tubal ligation reversal. Now, there is evidence on this that the success rate per IVF cycle is more when we go with IVF, but when we do tubal ligation reversal, the overall cumulative success rate, if we see over months, provided the semen parameters are normal and provided the female AMH is normal and her endometrium is normal, then that also has a good evidence of showing results. What are the factors to be considered when we are deciding regarding corrective surgery or IVF? We are often confused that in which cases should we go for corrective surgery, in which cases should we skip the corrective surgery and directly go for IVF. First, when the age of, that depends on the age of woman and ovarian reserve. So if she's young and ovarian reserve is good. Second, the number and quality of sperm if semen parameters are normal. Third, number of children raised. Fourth, site and extent of tubal disease. If the tubal damage is too much, then it's better that we go for IVF. Presence of other infertility factors. Risk of ectopic pregnancy. If these factors are there, it's better to go for IVF. Next, experience of surgeon. If we have a good experienced surgeon, then we know that yes, the chances of the couple conceiving are good when we do tubal reduction, reversal surgery or corrective surgery. But if we don't have an experienced surgeon, we know that the chances of conception are less, and then we know it's better to go for IVF. So that is about the tubal factor. Now, my next question is for Dr. Reema. Dr. Reema, what will be the ideal management according to you of a woman 33 years old trying to conceive since 5 years, having bilateral endometriomas 3 centimeter size and bilateral hydrosalpinges with AMH 3 and ET 7.4? I think Dr. Reema is not online. I'm going to answer this question. So basically, this woman has bilateral endometriomas and her tubes are damaged. So since she has bilateral hydrosalpinges, it's better to go with IVF in this case, and evidence says that if the hydrosalpinges are large, it's better to do a tubal delinking before going for IVF. So according to me, we would go for an antagonist protocol in this case. After that, once we have good embryos in hand, we can do a laparoscopic tubal delinking, and then we can go ahead with the embryo transfer. And since the semen analysis is normal. Now, what do the guidelines say about endometriosis? Now, we are often confused which patients should we operate, which patients should we not operate. So we should remember this very important point that in endometriosis, ASHRAE recent guidelines say that we are not supposed to operate apart from these 3 indications. First, when we are going for IVF, we know that we might anticipate a difficult oocyte retrieval and the endometrioma may come in our way, or we are scared of the rupture, then we can operate. Second, if the woman is having severe symptoms like dysmenorrhea and she's not comfortable at all with that, we can operate. Third, if we have suspicion of malignancy. These are the only 3 conditions where we are supposed to operate. Now, what do the guidelines say? Laparoscopy for minimal to mild cases is totally unwarranted, just like I explained. Stage 1 or 2, less than 35 years, what should be our plan of treatment? Expectant treatment with superovulation, or we can also go with IUI. What about stage 3 and 4? Stage 3 and 4, we can go with conservative surgery if I told you the 3 conditions where she has all the symptoms. Now, failure, if there is failure of above approach, or there is advanced stage of woman, her AMH is low, she is more than 35, it's better to go with IVF. My next question is for Dr. Natasha. Dr. Natasha, we often find adenomyosis in association with endometriosis. Do you have any comments on that? And how should infertility with adenomyosis be managed?
Yeah, Kanika very rightly said. With the increase of infertility, the number of patients suffering with endometriosis associated with adenomyosis has really increased. Now, if to talk about adenomyosis, you know what the incidence of adenomyosis is 20% in females of less than 40 years. And as they just reach 40 years and more, the incidence increases up to 80%. So now, usually these patients have symptoms of menorrhagia, dysmenorrhea, dyspareunia even. And that diagnosis of adenomyosis is very easy in nowadays. It can be easily done by a 2D probe or a 3D ultrasound. Even a 3D ultrasound will give you sensitivity and specificity, making our adenomyosis equal to MRI. Now, since it is an era of late marriages, women being more focused, more career oriented, so their family planning takes a step back. So usually these patients are females when they come to our clinic, they are usually more than 35 years of age. Now, adenomyosis, as per, do not hamper infertility. In case the male semen parameters are okay, tubes are fine, everything. But it causes a low implantation rate and thereby is a cause of miscarriages. Now, this low implantation rate could be because of the altered gene expression which these patients have. That's why decreased endometrial receptivity, or due to the dearrange or the junctional zone, which is actually seen if the junctional zone is more than equal to 12 mm, it is suggestive of severe adenomyosis. Now, in decades back, the adenomyosis only mode of treatment was either removal of the uterus or insertion of marina or some things which will not make these women go for fertility. But nowadays, these women, we can give them medical treatment in the form of GnRH analogs. We can give them injections, wait for 2-3 cycles. Every monthly injections can be given to them with the add back of calcium because of the bone density loss, and hence we can improve their miscarriage rates.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Natasha. So now I would like to talk about what evidence says about adenomyosis. So there is this study of adenomyosis and IVF ICSI treatment. It concluded that reduced fertility outcomes are related to the presence and extent of adenomyosis. GnRH treatment with add-back estrogen therapy had definitely a positive impact on implantation markers. Frozen embryo transfer. This is what we also follow. Frozen embryo transfer after long-term GnRH agonist treatment has found to be showing improved implantation rates and ongoing pregnancy rates. And studies say, so this is what we do when the embryos are ready, give them 2 to 3 injections of GnRH agonist depending on the extent of adenomyosis, and then do the embryo transfer where we assume that the GnRH agonist may produce a window of time for implantation. A very important thing we often get confused, this is a big adenomyosis, what we should do, should we proceed with the surgery or should we just give GnRH agonist treatment? So surgery, according to evidence, is indicated only in symptomatic women with repeated IVF ICSI failures after transfer of high quality embryos. So now we are moving towards the end of the session. My next question is on male infertility. I would like to ask Dr. Suthapan. Dr. Suthapan, a 28 years old male married to a 26-year-old nulliparous female trying to conceive since 1 year comes to you for treatment. His physical examination shows bilateral varicocele with slightly smaller testes. Semen analysis shows no sperms in the given sample. Testosterone shows 270 nanogram per DL. FSH is 8 milli international units per ml. How will you manage this case?
Yes, so it's a case of azoospermia. However, it has to be confirmed by centrifugation of the sample or by repeat semen analysis. And hormonal parameter like FSH is within normal limit. Testosterone is normal or borderline, and bilateral clinical varicocele with bilateral small testes, as revealed in physical examination, suggests that it's a case of non-obstructive azoospermia, and hence we should offer karyotype and Y chromosome microdeletion testing to rule out any genetic abnormality. And as per latest evidence, varicocele repair by ligation or embolization in men with non-obstructive azoospermia showed return of spermatogenesis in about 44% of treated men. And one important consideration has to be given to take consent for simultaneous testicular biopsy at the time of varicocele repair for prognostic information for the patient counseling, as varicocele surgery may be less effective when the patient shows the testicular biopsy shows maturation arrest or Sertoli cell-only syndrome. However, benefit has been seen for varicocele surgery when the testicular biopsy reveals hypospermatogenesis. Hence, testicular biopsy should be combined along with varicocele repair. And if no sperm in the ejaculate seen after 3 months post varicocelectomy, then the couple should be counseled for sperm retrieval technique using microtisa followed by ICSI.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Sutapon. Now, what does the ASRM recommendation say on non-obstructive azoospermia? They say that detection of genetic abnormalities should be done, like with the genetic counseling has to be done in men with non-obstructive azoospermia. Varicocelectomy should be considered in men with varicocele associated with NOA prior to sperm retrieval. Reported sperm retrieval rates in men with NOA are highest when we are using microtessel. Other options, including donor insemination and adoption, should be discussed with the patient. My next question for you, Dr. Sutapon, is a 40 years old male with 2 children from previous marriage, remarried to a 32 years old healthy nulliparous female, comes to clinic for fertility treatment. Vasectomy done 8 years back. On examination, both the testes are normal in size, but his semen analysis shows azoospermia. The testosterone level is 1600 nanogram per DL, FSH is less than 0.1, LH is less than 0.1. Now he wants a child with his own sperms. What treatment option would you like to offer this patient?
Okay, so as per history, 40 years old male with secondary infertility following vasectomy leads us to diagnosis of obstructive azoospermia. However, if we look into the hormonal parameter, it shows that hypogonadism, that is FSH and LH both below 0.1 and testosterone level is very high. 300 to 800 nanogram per DL being normal, here it is 1600 nanogram per DL. So he must be taking, so history should be, so we should track history for any steroid as health supplement. So diagnosis is being anabolic steroid induced hypogonadism, and it can result from prolonged suppression of hypothalamo-pituitary gonadal axis from exogenous androgen. So in this case, the diagnosis is azoospermia, and it is related to both obstructive pathology due to post vasectomy and non-obstructive etiology due to exogenous steroid intake. And for such male, for management, first of all, discontinuation of exogenous steroid or androgen and prevention of further use is recommended. And as time to recover of spermatogenesis is being suppressed, then administration of intramuscular HCG in the dose of 3000 international unit 2 to 3 times in a week for 3 months can expedite sperm recovery. And because higher dose of HCG can again suppress FSH, adding clomiphene citrate to preserve pituitary function is being recommended. And for vasectomy reversal, as per ASRM guideline, microsurgical reconstruction of the reproductive tract is generally preferred over sperm retrieval technique. However, the couple should be clearly counseled that likelihood for success with sperm retrieval by microtisa followed by ICSI, the success is more than with varicocele vasectomy reversal surgery.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Sutapon. Now let's see what the recommendations say regarding obstructive azoospermia. Now, obstructive azoospermia results from vasectomy. So this was a very interesting case of both obstructive and non-obstructive. So when obstructive azoospermia results from vasectomy and no coexisting female infertility factors are there, then microsurgical reconstruction of the reproductive tract is preferred over sperm retrieval and IVF ICSI. Now, sperm retrieval with IVF ICSI, when is it the best choice of treatment for obstructive azoospermia? In cases of rapidly diminishing ovarian reserve due to age or other conditions, coexisting female infertility factors that require IVF, or concomitant secondary male infertility. So these are the ASRM recommendations for obstructive azoospermia. Thank you very much. So that was the last question. Now, just in 1 minute, I'm going to summarize everything that we discussed today. First, we discussed about the evaluation of a female. In that, we discussed about how we'll evaluate her endometrium, her ovulatory function, her tubes, and then we discussed about the semen analysis, the male semen analysis, and specialized tests only in certain cases. If the woman is more than 35 years, we must check her ovarian reserve as well, and we must do her infertility evaluation within 6 months only. Then we discussed about the management for 6 months. Only in indicated cases, as Dr. Anuja said, we can go with natural planning. After 6 months, we can go with IUI, where we can go for 3 to 4 cycles of IUI. Once they fail, we can go for IVF ICSI. We must go for IVF ICSI. Then we discussed case-wise. We discussed about unexplained infertility, how oral agents with IUI is the best option, and that too letrozole is the best option for unexplained infertility. Then if 3 to 4 cycles of IUI fail, we have to think about IVF ICSI. In PCOS, we learned that clomiphene citrate with metformin is better as an ovulation induction agent. In endometriosis, we learned that we are not supposed to operate for unindicated cases. We are supposed to operate only if there is pain, there is we are anticipating difficult ovum pickup, or there is suspicion of malignancy. Then in tubal block also, we learned how tubal cannulation can be done in proximal tubal block, mild hydrosalpinges, how we can do a laparoscopic neosalpingostomy. Then in huge hydrosalpinges, it's always better to de-link and then go for IVF. And also in adenomyosis, we learned that we must give GnRH agonist before embryo transfer, because that is creating some window for implantation. And Dr. Sutapon also briefly, nicely described about obstructive azoospermia and non-obstructive azoospermia, and when sperm retrieval is better than the microsurgical extraction. So thank you all very much. I hope we could clarify some doubts, and I hope we could make it a little simpler for you from now onwards in the post-corona phase. Let's hope the post-corona phase comes soon.